Welcome to The Real News. I'm Eddie Conway from Baltimore. I recently had the opportunity to do a special interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates at his former residence where he grew up and where I now reside.
My name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm a national correspondent for the Atlantic magazine. More importantly, I'm the son of Paul Coates, who was in the Black Panther Party, defense captain of the Black Panther Party for a couple years. Was in the Panther Party with you. Although I believe you predate him in the party. I believe you were in the party before him, as I recall. And I'm just going to tell this from the perspective of who I was as a child and what I understood at that point. I understood that my dad was in something called the Panther Party. I understood that the Panthers carried guns. I'm talking like 5 years old, like what I can recall, like how I saw it then. I understood that several of the people, or a few of the people who my dad had been in the party with, well, a few of them were out because they would come to the house, right, and they would visit. Like Brother Howard, like they would come and visit. Bomani, a few folks like that. But I also understood there were a number of them who were in jail. And I couldn't quite conceive of what jail was, but I remember coming to see you. And what I remember, and this must have, my dad is telling me this would have been at the penitentiary, not out at Jessup. But like gates, like bars with gates. Yeah. And I remember several of them closing. And what I remember is that, was there like a wooden divider that you would look across and talk? I remember that. And I remember that Brother Eddie was in jail, and Brother Eddie was accused of shooting a police officer. And that, a big part of my dad's work was for Brother Eddie to, regain his freedom. And it was just this thing that was constant. And I have to tell you that it is amazing to see you out now. Because it went on for like so much. I guess it went on for my entire childhood and then continued to go. This is like, my dad's commitment, other folks' commitment, obviously your commitment, obviously. I don't know how it feels to fight for something for 40 years. And like when I think about it now, I don't know if this will I guess it will make sense to you. I had prepared in my mind, like when I thought about it, like for you to be in prison for the rest of your life. Like that's like, like in my mind, that was a strong, strong possibility, and
because so many decades had passed and the experience was what you were going on.
Yeah, and also I think it was my sense of the authorities.
Okay.
Like knowing, like as I, gained some knowledge on what the Panther Party was, my sense of what the police are, and how the authorities are. And I was coming up in a time where, it was, the way people dealt with incarceration was changing, and people were getting, much, much more hard, even more harsher. And I couldn't conceive of this moment. I really couldn't. So it's amazing to be here.
I think what's really amazing is the fact that you're sitting here on this porch.
Yeah.
And it has a significance in your entire life. Can you explain to us what that significance is?
This house, as we were talking about before, was when I was coming up, and I guess it isn't still now, was just filled with books. And that was the main thing. And this is, I don't know how to express this, but this is the place, this is where I was living when I garnered a lot of my views on the world. What it meant to be like black in society, what it meant to be black in Baltimore. I think about this now, and I'm writing about this a little bit in a book that's coming out in September, but so this was like my neighborhood, and I could walk, through this neighborhood generally and be safe. But I couldn't really go beyond Mondawmin Mall. I couldn't go across Liberty Heights over the Park Heights. I couldn't go past Gwynn Falls towards North Avenue. You really didn't do that. It wasn't safe for you. I was talking about this coming over. Your grandmother better live over there. You better know somebody over there, or something. You don't just. And so that feeling of being bound was like immediately present for me. I went to Lamel, which is just back across, behind them woods. It's shut down now. But that feeling of being bound was very, very familiar to me. And I've thought about this, like just with like incarceration and prison. In many ways, I feel like a lot of the neighborhoods that black folks live in, it preps them for that experience. the sheer violence of what it means to be incarcerated is already, to a lesser degree, but already present in the neighborhood. The sheer lack of having, the same amount of freedoms that other people have is already present in your life. I mean, I say this all the time, but I would, be a kid and I would watch all the TV shows, and you see like the little children who are your age, and they, they go wherever they want. They ride their bikes all day, do whatever, and that just was not present in my life. And so like this was like the first place where I really got a sense of what that was.
How many years you spent in this house here growing up? Can you remember from your starting date to
I think we moved here when I was 9 and we left when I was 14. So it would have been 5 years, but 9 to 14 are like, I mean, that really is like
that's
child to young man. I mean, that's such a crucial, so it felt like much longer.
Yeah.
I think it was the house we lived in the most too. We lived over on Woodbrook for a while. I was born up on Park Heights. We lived out in Edmondson Village for a few months, and then, my folks moved out towards Woodlawn.
Your book, that Beautiful Struggle.
Yeah.
You cover a lot of this neighborhood.
Yeah.
I was curious, and of course I know you came down and you discussed it. You came into prison.
I did, yeah, down to Jessup.
But I was always left wondering, and you might have explained it in the book, but explain it now. Why did you call it The Beautiful Struggle?
Well, I ain't call it The Beautiful Struggle. That's the funny thing. My editor, it was my editor's title. It was my editor's title. And I think like his basic point with that title, which I disagreed with at the time, was that all of the sort of, trauma that black folks go through, all of the, quote unquote struggling is in fact actually beauty. That there's great beauty in it. That there's something to be lived and loved in that. You know what I mean? Because like my concern, even as I wrote about like what was happening in Baltimore, I didn't want people to pity Baltimore. I didn't want people to like think of like the neighborhood as just a like abstract social experiment. I mean, it was. I loved being here. And I loved being alive at the time I was alive, and I can say that even, with everything else I was saying about, figuring out the rules. It was a very like, it's a very interesting time to be alive. And it was beautiful, and black folks are beautiful. And I think like there's a tendency that when we talk about all the things that are wrong and not quite right, like we can lose ourselves and our humanity in that.
You also came down to another jail that I was in, the Maryland House of Correction, and I remember, and that was just before you dropped out of Howard, I believe.
That was. I came down to write about you.
Yeah.
That wasn't Jessup. Where were we?
Both of them, all of them.
All of them are in Jessup, but it's a different prison. Okay.
Jails.
Yeah.
Like about 5 major jails in the Jessup area, right? And obviously it traumatized me more than you in terms of finding out you was dropping out of Howard. So you dropped out of Howard at what point and why?
Shortly or about the time I came to see you, because that was like one of the first like really, like I had the idea to write that article and I wrote it a certain way, and it felt so good to do it. And it, writing was like one of the first things I could do and get like really positive feedback. I had never been a particularly good student.
Are you saying I caused you to drop out of Howard?
Well, I actually, yeah. I mean, yeah, well, the experience of writing that article was part of my decision, because it was like, oh, I can do this. I'm actually good at something, and like I could like get better at this if I practiced at it. And Howard costs money. But when I wrote, like, people gave me money. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, if I got good enough at this one day, like I could actually make a living. So I believe I was about 19 or 20 when I came down there to see you, and yeah, it was a huge thing. It was a huge thing to me. And I just, in that way, I was sort of like my dad. My dad, he got all these books all over the house and everything, and he he went back to school and got his degree and everything right after the party. Most of his education was outside, and I felt like
he already had an education when he went back to school.
Oh yeah, he did. And so for me, like, it was clear that you didn't really have to just sit if you really were committed to educating yourself, you didn't have to necessarily sit in a classroom. And once at the time, once I knew what I wanted to do, that was it.
But apparently you had became a very successful writer.
Well, not when I left. when I left, I thought, like when I left, well, I left, again, like it took a very, very long time, probably about 15 years before I could like really say I could stably support myself.
Did you do other things in the?
I did. I worked.
You worked on a railroad or something?
No, I worked as a I worked as a food delivery person.
Okay.
Yeah, like I delivered food. You know, I did whatever. I did whatever I could do, whatever I had to do in order to like support the writing for a long time. You know, and then in fact, it was really when I got my job that I have right now at the Atlantic, and I've been there about 2015. I've been there about 7 years now. It was really when I came there that it started, that my life started to stabilize. But you know, I understand the concern, I understand the worry. I will say that I think like a lot of times when people drop out, they just have no clue what they're gonna do. But I knew what I wanted to do. I knew like what direction I wanted to go in, so I did have that. I think that helped, you know.
Thank you for joining us with this interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Please join us for the next segment in which he will talk about reparation. And thank you for joining The Real News.